I'm Susan Howards, a local domestic violence attorney in Brookline, and this is The Safety Net, Brookline Interactive Access Cable TV show devoted to domestic violence and other topics during this trying time of COVID. With us today, we are so lucky to have Tissa Hami. She is just your average Ivy League graduate, turned investment banker, turned stand-up comic, turned consultant. She's the founder and principal of Corsi Consulting, which specializes in diversity, equity, inclusion, consulting, and training, so necessary today. Well known for her groundbreaking work as female Muslim stand-up comic, Tissa has conducted over 400 performances, speaking engagements, and training programs across the country for an array of clients, including corporations, nonprofits, and university. Prior to her DEI, which stands for Diversity and Inclusion, Tissa worked on Wall Street, where she was often the only, quote unquote, in the room, the only woman, the only person of color, or immigrant. She brings this experience and perspective to her work in building inclusive workplaces where all employees belong and can thrive. A passionate advocate, Tissa has been a featured speaker at a number of conferences, including the Conference Board's annual DEI conference, Harvard Law School's Islam in the West program, and the Ford Foundation's Difficult Dialogues program. She has been featured in media and worldwide, including the PBS documentary Stand Up, ABC's The View, Australia's Dateline, BBC NPR, and the Boston Globe Sunday Magazine. Tissa holds a BA from Brown University and an MIA from Columbia University. She is working toward a better world, one organization at a time. Welcome, Tissa.
Thank you so much, Susan. Thanks for having me today.
Oh, I'm delighted. Would you mind telling us a little bit about your upbringing and your childhood?
Sure. So I was actually born in Iran, and I moved to this country with my parents when I was 5 years old, and they came here as graduate students to the Boston area. They were studying abroad, and while we were here, the Iranian Revolution happened. Saddam Hussein invaded our country. So Iran was in turmoil. We had every intention of going back after my parents' studies were finished, but people told us, you know, things are chaotic here. If you're out, stay out. So we did. And so we ended up settling in the Boston area. Those first few years, we lived in Medford, Boston, Brookline for 2 years. I went to first and second grade in Brookline. And then we settled in Lexington, and that's where I grew up.
Tissa, this is an odd question, but what made you want to become a stand-up comic with all of your degrees and background and your parents?
I know. I mean, my father has a PhD in computer science. He's a software engineer, retired now. My mother is a pediatric dentist. And so I thought I would have a pretty traditional career. But for me, growing up Iranian in a really white town and a white community, it really shaped who I was as that sort of outsider, as that other. And it was really, you know, I tried to take that traditional path, went to what I thought was, you know, the right schools, all of that, went to Wall Street. Always just felt like an outsider. And for me, it was really after 9/11. And I remember there were all these terrible, obviously a terrible event. And then sort of as a Middle Eastern person, there was an additional piece to it, which was all the assumptions made about us, that we were hostage takers, that we were terrorists, that Muslim women were oppressed and didn't have a voice. To me, it was a reminder a bit of when I was a kid and the hostage crisis happened. And it was a terrible time to be Iranian. And I'll say it was never a good time to be Iranian. It's not like anti-Muslim discrimination began on 9/12. It existed before, but it just in a different way after 9/11. And I just remember thinking, what can I do? What can I do? And my whole life, people had told me, whether in school or at work, you're so funny, you should be a stand-up comic. And I thought, no, I shouldn't. Like that's what, that's not what we do. We're Ivy League grads, whatever. But for me, when I started to see stand-up comedy as a way to speak up, speak out, use your voice, have a platform, make your opinions heard, that's when I became interested. And so that's why I went into it. I really went into it from the point of view of an activist.
Oh my goodness. So is that how you got into diversity, equity, inclusion consulting?
I would say once I started doing comedy, and I really just went into it to be a comedian, I started getting requests for other things. I started getting requests for speaking engagements, for workshops, for workshops at academic conferences, to write a book. I started hearing these other requests. I said no to some of them, yes to others. But I started comedy in 2002. I hadn't really heard the words diversity and inclusion yet. But as my comedy career started to wind down, and this was around 2015, I just sort of thought, okay, what's next? And I went into a day job in higher ed that just for other reasons didn't work out. And I thought, okay, let me rethink what to do here. That job was pretty dead end anyway. And I thought, how can I bring everything together? And I started to hear these words, diversity and inclusion. And when I read about it, I was like, this is what I've been doing the whole time. I just wasn't calling it that. So for me, it was a natural shift to then go into diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting. It also brought in my Wall Street background from years before, which I had always thought, I'm not really using that background in a way that I could and want to. So diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting and training really brings together everything I've been doing all these years, everything I want, and all the things I want to do. I want to make companies better. I want to make the work experience better, particularly for people from underrepresented minorities. I have been through a lot at work. I went through a lot those years on Wall Street. It was not for lack of competence. It was not for lack of intelligence. It was just something else. And I hesitated to call it discrimination, but frankly, it was.
Smacks of discrimination. Yes.
Was that?
I said it just, what you're talking about, smacks of discrimination.
Exactly.
Capital letters. And I'm sorry that you went through that, but
Thank you.
do you think that things have changed? I do discrimination at the Mass Commission Against Discrimination, and I'm wondering how you handle that, being a woman, being a Muslim woman, and being on Wall Street. I doubt there were many women there. I'm sure there were not many Muslim women there. So if I may ask, how do you handle it? Do you just fluff it aside, or did you go home and cry every night?
Yeah, when I was on Wall Street, as I like to say, it was back in the 1900s. So it was the late 1900s. But yeah, things were different there, and there's definitely been improvements with time. But yeah, I would go in, and I remember I was in an analyst training program at JP Morgan, which is that entry-level program, and already only 27% of the class was women. And it only thinned out from there. And that was back in 1997. So even at the lowest levels, they weren't getting very many women, even fewer women of color. One thing I know now, jumping way ahead, is at every organization I've ever worked with, talked to, across industries, no matter what, the most difficult experiences are encountered by women of color. So having that identity at any organization is the most difficult, and those experiences really, their experiences really need to be heard, talked about, highlighted, and recognized as having the most difficult. Yes.
Tissa, who's talking about them? Where can we listen? Where can we learn? We, meaning me. How is this information being disseminated? Or is it? I bet it's made.
Yeah, so we see different things. There are internal things and external. So we see a lot of companies these days having those internal conversations, having the town halls, for example, following the murder of George Floyd. I've heard mixed things about those town halls, about their effectiveness and how they were handled. But again, that's one way that people are having those conversations internally. They're doing them through other things, for example, through diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, whether it's through a training program, through an assessment process. That's how I hear those stories, by doing needs assessments at companies. And I get told those stories. And I appreciate that people open up. Yes.
Do you think the complaints to the Mass Commission Against Discrimination have increased during this time, during COVID, or say the last year?
I don't have those numbers. I don't know if you have those numbers. I wouldn't be surprised if they have, and whether that's because more things have happened or people feel more able to speak about them, that would be the question. But I wouldn't be surprised if we see an uptick in those types of complaints. But yeah, I mean, so internally people are having those conversations. Externally, I see a lot of webinars now that are open to the public, which is so fantastic. If we're all going to be, or many of us, at home, working from home, a lot of learning has gone online. A decent amount of it is free. So if you go to LinkedIn and you look for webinars, you'll see all sorts of webinars on these topics, and you will hear from voices that we don't always hear from. And again, we were talking about women of color and their experiences in the workplace. So there is good content out there. And again, anyone who works in this is able to do that programming also.
Do you have an area that you specialize in now? I'd say, yeah, during this time of COVID.
During COVID. So during COVID is interesting, because normally at Corsi Consulting, we provide the whole range of DEI consulting services, from assessments to training to consulting, and specializing in, especially because of my background as a performer, specializing in theater-based performance programs. So things like interactive theater, interactive storytelling. Now, obviously that changes when we're from home, when we're working from home. But one thing that is obviously, the reasons for it are tragic, that we're seeing the police brutality and the murder of Black citizens, and the reasons for it are terrible. What it has prompted, though, is for organizations to rethink their policies. We're seeing companies interested in anti-racism. We're seeing terms I didn't think even like 6 months ago we would be talking about at companies: white supremacy, anti-racism efforts. So these things are being talked about in companies now. So it's it really is an opportunity to have discussions at a level that we haven't had them before.
It sure is. What challenges are not companies, but say the public sector, local governments, local departments, not necessarily police, but fire, transportation, recreation? What challenges are they facing? And are you called upon to do any training, and are you available to do training to local governments?
Sure. So local governments, I will say, I have worked with a bit less. Whatever the reason for that is, whether that's budget and resources, I don't know. Mm-hmm. I do know I have colleagues who have worked with police departments, for example. But certainly the public sector they answer to us, the public, so there's a different challenge there. One thing that I would say in looking at organizations across the spectrum is certain challenges are the same no matter where you are. Mm-hmm. And I would say the two biggies are always racism and sexism. Those are always the biggest. And then there are some of the other factors that you need to look at. And one thing I hear, again, this is more through the research, but how toxic is the workplace? Is it a healthy workplace? Is it not? And the more hierarchical, in general, the more hierarchical an institution is, the more there's potential for toxicity, for things like workplace bullying. So government agencies, usually being quite hierarchical, that can be a factor.
Wow, and what about harassment of women and employer-employee, not domestic violence, but violence against women? Women of color, what is your experience with that?
Sure. So I want to say I'm definitely not like an expert on the legal side of this or on sexual harassment law. I come at it from, and actually I think this is an interesting point. One point I try to make to organizations I work with is, if you want to get your DEI right, you have to make sure you're handling sexual harassment properly, or you're handling that issue well. You have to make sure you're handling workplace bullying well, even if the laws are not there. And the laws are generally there for sexual harassment, whether they're followed or not. You know, we've seen terrible examples. But workplace bullying, there are very few states with those laws on the books. But again, are you only trying to be legally compliant, or are you trying to actually have a good workplace where people want to be every day?
Right, right. What is overlooked when we talk about DEI? Not just companies, but in general. What am I overlooking in talking to you? And I know I'm overlooking something.
Yeah, that's a great question. And like I said, tying it in with the other things that are going on at companies. Sometimes DEI is treated like it's some side issue, and you have, you know, an entire organization, a huge organization will have one person who's in charge of DEI for the entire organization. That's a lot to ask of anyone. And again, treating it as a side issue is not the way to go. You want it really embedded into the DNA of the entire organization. In terms of what's overlooked, again, tie it in with sexual harassment, with workplace bullying, because look at who the targets of that are. By and large, the targets of sexual harassment are women.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It can be men, it can be other genders, but by and large, it's women. And so if you're telling me, well, we just can't find women for senior positions, what has happened? And I can tell you sexual harassment is part of that. Workplace bullying, and all these things, by the way, women of color are disproportionately targeted in all of these. So that's always an issue. But tying it in with other issues, other things, and these are, I would say they need to be approached a little more gently sometimes. But once you have people, you have all the issues that having multiple people in a room have. So again, with DEI, what about egos? What about office politics? What about the pettiness that we see and hear about in organizations every day? All of that is involved in the concepts of inclusion and belonging. Who belongs, who gets ahead, who gets what work assignment, and again, women of color we see are the ones expected. You know, if you're in a meeting, for example, and you're a woman and you're the only woman in the room, do people look at you automatically to be the one who takes notes?
Yes,
that happened to you. Yeah, I think it's happened to a lot of women, that they just look to you automatically as the one who's going to take the notes, the one who's going to order lunch, the one who's going to clean up the room after everybody has left.
Make the coffee.
Make the coffee, exactly. And
hello.
the studies have been done. The women of color take on the housework and household chores of an organization at a higher rate than anyone else. And I will say this about men, the companies that have tried to do this and say, okay, men pitch in, men will come in and do a shoddy job, or they'll put like one plate in the corner so that they are never asked to do it again. And so how do you handle this?
That happened to me. I was always asked, this is when I was a college professor, to make the coffee. And I got so fed up. Those days you didn't speak up. Yeah. I made it so strong the water couldn't go through it. Dignitaries there. And my boss, who was the president of the college, was livid. I said, oh, I'm so sorry. I just don't know how. I was never asked again. I mean, it was like a lump. And you have to find, in those days, this was a long time ago, you had to find ways around because you couldn't go over the mountain.
Exactly.
Is DEI only for underrepresented minorities or for everybody? I mean, do I need the training as much as, say, you?
So the training, absolutely. It should go to everyone. And there are ways to roll out a training that tend to work a bit better. But in terms of, is it for everyone? It's absolutely for everyone. And sometimes people think, oh, well, diversity, that's for, you know, that's for people with, that's for diverse people. First of all, I'll say there's no diverse people. You can have a group that's diverse, but an individual is not diverse. but they think it's for people from an underrepresented minority. But what the research shows us, and this is great, is that inclusion helps everyone in an organization, including the white men.
Mm-hmm.
And there's there's been studies on this concept called covering, where people have said that they have to cover at least part of their identity when they come into work. And again, from the landmark research, this is not my language, but people said things like, well, I could be gay, but not too gay at work, or I could be.
Covering is you're not all of what you are, but you're part of it, or do you have to hide everything?
Exactly, and it depends. How much of yourself do you feel that you have to cover at work? And how much can you bring to the workplace without having to hide it? So again, people thought, okay, I can be a parent, but I can't be too much of a mommy. Again, words from the study. So what was interesting about this, we might expect that underrepresented minorities have to do quite a bit of covering, and definitely the percentages were higher in those groups. But what the research found that was even 45% of white men said that they covered some aspect of their identity when they went into work. And so what that shows us is inclusion lifts everyone, not just your underrepresented minorities. It helps everyone.
Tissa, what makes your work really hard?
What makes it hard? There are different things. One is I think the message, and this is really good, the message has gotten to many, if not most, company leadership that there is a business case for diversity. And so we know that organizations with more diversity and more diverse leadership and more diverse boards, et cetera, perform better. The business case for this is very clearly out there, to the point that a lot of DEI consultants will say, I'm not interested in talking about the business case with anybody anymore. If that's where you all are in your conversations, fine. When you get to the next point, come and talk to me. So there's also that. Yeah. But the business case argument has gotten out there.
What about the schools? Not to interrupt, but has the argument for the schools to have this kind of training from kindergarten up, has that gotten out there? It seems to me that would be a prime site for your training.
I totally agree. And I think what we see, for example, with schools, what I often hear is, and this is usually through friends trying to recommend me, they say they don't have a budget, they probably won't be able to afford you.
So is that a veil that they don't want the training? Or do you think, well, probably today with the economy the way it is, it may be a little bit true, but normally is that just a veil sort of to keep you away and stay out of this?
I mean, it may well be. I guess I don't know the answer to that ultimately about why something doesn't come through. I don't always know. But I think budget is often an issue, but it is, I mean, I think to your point, where are you allocating your budget and how much are you making this a priority? So if this is a priority for you, you will find the budget to do the work. So that's kind of what I think. And when I hear from these multi-million-dollar companies that don't have the resources, and then you can look up the pay of the CEO and the et cetera, and you say, okay, you have the money. You're just not allocating it in this way.
So they value it. It's not a value.
Right. And so that gets to another challenge, which is lip service. How much is it lip service? Yes, we're diverse, and you can go to almost, probably just about any major company today and go to their website, and they'll have a diversity statement. They'll have pictures of people from different races on their website. But if you talk internally, people may not feel that they have opportunities. They may not feel included.
One last question. Do you work with immigrants, or whether they have papers or not? Do you work with any organizations that are dealing with the crisis we have with immigration?
Oh, gosh. Currently, no. I would love to.
Okay.
I would love to. But again, I mean, what I hear, and I'm thinking of one that has come up as a potential, what I hear is budget. I hear this budget issue again and again. And what I want to say is let's talk.
Okay.
Let's have the conversation, because what I want, and again, this is about why I do the work. I want to do the work. I want to be of use. I want to be of assistance. I want to see us do better. I want to see organizations do better. I want that welcoming, inclusive environment where people want to go to work, or at the very least, don't hate it. But this is our lives. I mean, work is a big part of our lives. And so right. Where I can be of service, you know, at Corsi, I say we're working toward a more equitable world. That's what I want.
Tissa, thank you so much for being with us today. In the last minute we have, how can people get in touch with you quickly?
Oh, yes. So I am available at corsiconsulting.com. That's KORSI consulting.com. And you can reach me through the website. I'm also on social media. You can follow me on LinkedIn and find Corsi on LinkedIn and Facebook.
Thank you so much. I wish you all the best with your very, very, very important work, particularly today.
Thank you so much, Susan. I appreciate it.
Okay, bye-bye.